Are you free? You wish you were. You wish you were able to choose what you did and when. But are you? You may think you are free. You're not in prison. You're not under threat of attack or kidnapping by powerful organisations. You're probably free, right? Well, you aren't. And here's why. If you haven't watched it yet, please watch my previous video before this one for a better understanding of what I'm going to be talking about in this video. This video will be about the most effective method for mass manipulation of a society's inhabitants. In my previous video, I talked about a process called operant conditioning, where I mentioned the basics of the process, but it's much more complex than that, so I do think it deserves a video of its own. In this video, I aim to explain the 5 different types of interactions present within operant conditioning and how operant conditioning is used in wider society to control human behaviour outside of just the school environment. From parenting and relationships, to schooling and politics, to manipulation and enhanced interrogation, all the way to gambling and even playing video games. The phenomenon of operant conditioning will be observed across all of man's interactions with his brethren and nature itself. First up, we need to know what operant conditioning is. Operant conditioning is a method for controlling the behaviour of a subject into something desirable by altering their outside environment. This could involve the addition of a stimulus or the removal of a stimulus, and these additions or removals can either seek to promote a behaviour or disincentivize a behaviour. The idea of operant conditioning goes back to the experiments from Burroughs Frederick Skinner, a psychologist and behaviourist who is most well known for his experiments on animals in controlled environments. Most notably his experiments on pigeons, teaching them to peck a button and do a 360-degree revolution to be rewarded with grain. On the surface, this experiment shows that rewarding a subject for a behaviour causes that behaviour to be used more and more often, as the subject will expect a similar reaction. This is one method of operant conditioning, known as positive reinforcement. In this video, expect to hear these 4 terms often, as they will explain the 4 main methods of operant conditioning. These terms are positive and negative, and reinforcement and punishment. Positive refers to the addition of a stimulus, so for example, turning on a light, talking to someone, touching objects around you. Positive experiences all have this in common. This goes for both voluntary interactions within the environment, i.e. using a switch to turn on a light, and involuntary stimuli, which can involve someone else turning on the light without you interacting with the switch. When it comes to operant conditioning, we are mainly focused on the latter. When it comes to operant conditioning, we are focused on the involuntary changes within our environments and how to obtain them if they are beneficial to us, or avoid them if they're detrimental to us. Negative is the opposite to positive. Negative interactions involve the removal of a stimulus, so for example turning off the light or ending a conversation are both examples of negative interactions. In this field of study, positive and negative are not emotionally loaded terms. Positive is not necessarily good, and negative is not necessarily bad. All these terms refer to is the addition or removal of a stimulus. The axis which involves the perceptions of good and bad is the reinforcement-punishment axis. This axis determines if the occurrence of behaviour is to be increased or decreased. Reinforcement is about increasing the occurrence of behaviour. If the behaviour of another person is beneficial to you in some way, it is in your self-interest to increase the frequency of that behaviour. Your interactions to attain this goal can be referred to as reinforcement. You are reinforcing those behaviours by changing their outside environment. The same goes for punishment. Punishment is the opposite of reinforcement. Punishment is aimed at reducing the frequency of a behaviour. So like reinforcement, punishment can be used to control the outside environment of a subject to influence them to refrain from taking part in activities which oppose your self-interest. So to recap, positive and negative mean the addition and removal of stimuli respectively, whilst reinforcement and punishment are based off either an incentive for more frequent behaviour or a disincentive to result in less frequent behaviour. We can plot this on a two-way graph. At the top, we have if the interaction adds or removes stimuli, positive and negative, whilst on the left we have the goal of adding or reducing their behaviour, which can either involve making the behaviour more frequent or less frequent. Knowing this, we can analyse the different interactions which we have with each other, showing how these forces can be used to benefit the subject in the future, or how these forces can be used to compromise the subject in the future. In the opening to this video, I discussed 8 different situations which range from minor interactions with more subtle effects, to essential interactions, to interactions which are only desirable for the people in control, and not the subject. Let's first go back in time to the time that you were unable to walk and talk, back to the times of crawling and babbling. Your parents want you to grow up into an independent individual who can provide for him or herself, and someone who can participate in society to a high enough degree. So to ensure this, they help you walk and they try to teach you basic words. Think what your first word was. What happened when you uttered your first word? You probably can't remember, but more than likely, it was an incidence of positive reinforcement. You got pleasurable reactions from your family for meeting your developmental milestones, so you kept it going. You learned to walk and talk. You learned to string words together into increasingly complex sentences. You learned basic literacy and numeracy skills from the natural teaching instincts which parents have for their children. They want you to be the best vessel for the continuation of the family that you could possibly be. And let's look at the opposite side of childhood. More than likely you've been a bit of a brat once in a while. Maybe you threw your food around the kitchen or you were screaming very loudly. Those interactions would result in punishment, most likely. Your parents don't want those behaviours. Go to your room. Sit in the naughty corner for every minute of your age. That's an example of negative punishment. Negative punishment is the removal of pleasurable stimuli to make the subject realise that these experiences aren't taken for granted. Sitting in the corner being forbidden to communicate with others or play computer games is an undesirable outcome, and thus this behaviour is lessened because you don't want to lose those stimuli. Looking at our graph, we can place these interactions on it. The appraisal from our parents can go in the positive reinforcement area, and the timeout can go in the negative punishment area. So how do these axes affect you later in life? You're now an adult, and you're ready to enter a relationship with another human. Well, let's think this through. The reason for these relationships is a mutually beneficial relationship, i.e., you receive something from your partner, whilst at the same time giving them an incentive to continue the relationship. You have to provide back in some way, or the relationship doesn't exist. This goes for both friendships and sexual partners. We only stay around other people if there's a reason to do so, and we can plot these on our graph. Giving your partner a gift, for example, is positive reinforcement. It gives your partner a reason to stay with you, and thus the frequency of whatever behaviour before the gift is given is increased. Within small-scale relations such as friends and family, operant conditioning will still exist, but its effects are mostly beneficial for all participants. Aside from the odd abusive relationship, which we'll get into later, the process of operant conditioning for learning is mostly helpful to bring dependent humans incapable of any self-sufficiency towards independence, and the ability to thrive without another person having to do everything for them. You may think of it as a goal to own your own house, and that's why you see it that way. It's a goal formed by external culture and the shaming and shunning of people who decide to live with their parents further into life for whatever reason they may have. But hey, maybe it's for the best. Independence and self-sufficiency are important if you find yourself outside of the security that civilization grants you. But in order to not go off a tangent, we move on to the more nefarious uses of operant conditioning to instill learned behaviours which are only beneficial to an outside force as tools of control. The things that don't help the individual. Let's first talk about the school system. If you don't remember, I made a whole video about that topic, you might remember. If you haven't watched that, then you should watch it after this one. There it is in the top right of the video. Click that to get to the schooling video. Anyway, How does schooling use the 4 quadrants of our operant table? Well, we discussed the presence of meaningless doggy treat rewards so the child sits when their trainer tells them to. We discussed the presence of stickers and the point system, which results in very minor rewards to promote obedience in the mind of a child who is still yet to understand the concept of the value of commodities. This can fit under positive reinforcement, adding a stimulus to increase behaviour. We can also look at the opposite, which could involve putting the child in detention for not doing their homework. This example of punishment is a negative form, as being in detention will remove the child from whatever they want to be doing. Whatever stimuli at the moment the child wishes to sample are unavailable. We can now bring in another quadrant, the negative reinforcement quadrant. Negative reinforcement is used to avoid punishments. So for example, the child, when they get home, will do whatever homework they've got to do in order to avoid the negative punishment of detention, which we've talked about previously. This process is known as escape. The child is escaping detention by engaging in an externally influenced task, i.e. homework. The child doesn't do the homework from their own free will. The environment is controlled by external factors which take away the child's preferred decisions of going to his friend's house, not bothering about the homework, and not getting detention. This, however, is not possible. The requirement for operant conditioning is a controlled environment, and in this example, such a controlled environment exists. Keeping this in mind, we can look at the case of adulthood in a similar manner. The state creates an operant environment by limiting the choices you, as an individual, has. You have an enforced duty to pay ransom to whichever government you happen to live under, regardless of if you use government services or not. When you pay your taxes, you are doing it as a form of escape, a form of negative reinforcement to ensure you avoid, or escape, the violence that the state could do against you. It's like paying protection money to the mafia. Pay them, or worse stuff happens. This example, albeit more severe, uses the same mechanisms as the school system. To avoid punishment and coercion being used against you, you have to engage in a task to satisfy the more powerful institutions which dominate over you. The legal term for this is extortion. In operant conditioning, we call the act to avoid punishment escape. Paying your taxes is a form of escape, which is a section under negative reinforcement. The threat is positive punishment, as in being coerced violently into being incarcerated. It's also negative punishment, as in being imprisoned also removes many stimuli you used to pleasure yourself before. But what if I told you that the same systems that are used in the school system are also used in Guantanamo Bay? Because they are. That isn't an exaggeration. Torture has its place in the operant table as well. One of the most infamous examples of torture in the Western world happened in the Guantanamo Bay detention facility in a US-occupied region of Cuba, along with many other CIA prison facilities across the Middle East. These actions range from the well-known waterboarding, otherwise known as simulated drowning, to hypothermia torture, which involved holding detainees in inhospitable temperatures for the purposes of interrogation. Some of these enhanced interrogation techniques have been known to kill their subjects, and knowing this, what would you do? You don't want to die, do you? So you have to play along regardless if you're guilty or not. You better tell them what they want to hear in order to avoid the torture, and if you don't, who knows what they'll do to you. You are forced to tell them what they want to hear, regardless of if it's the truth or a lie. Once again, you're controlled. The environment around you makes your actions and takes away the decision-making power that you had outside of this situation. But surely you can avoid operant conditioning in your leisure time. Surely you can avoid the same manipulation that you experience in Gitmo when you're just enjoying yourself, playing a new game that just came out, right? Wrong. Even in your free time, doing the things you enjoy, you can't avoid the operant conditioning phenomenon. Even games decide when you can play them now. We've all been there. You come to a hard level, and unfortunately, you can't get past it. You run out of lives and have to wait. You can't play for 30 minutes until your next life. But wait, that's not logical. You want people playing the game more, not less, right? Wrong. What's actually happening here is your brain is being exploited without your knowledge. Imagine it this way. Video games are a drug. They stimulate your brain into producing dopamine, the brain's reward chemical. When we've got enough dopamine in the brain, we feel happy, we feel satisfied. Our brains love that stuff. But as we get satisfied, we cut off more synapses so we don't get stuck doing the same thing over and over again. You remember when playing your favourite game that you eventually just kind of forgot about it? You play it for the last time, saying you'll play it tomorrow, but never do. You lose interest in it and move on to something else. This happens because our brain reduces sensitivity to a stimulus if it's constant or near constant. It's the same reason why the US justice system is an abject failure with higher recidivism rates than the much more comfortable and habitable Norwegian prisons, often stereotyped by Americans as hotels, despite the American system being much more harsh and much more punitive. The use of punishment over a constant period results in the desensitization to those noxious stimuli, or absence of stimuli. As a stimulus is experienced more and more, our brain disables more synapses to lower the effect of that stimulus. The result of that is the phenomenon of hardened criminals which aren't affected by the system. Being punished is not going to change them when their sentence is up. To an authoritarian regime desperate for control over their populace, they have to do more than just locking up political prisoners. This is the reason they have to get the citizens when they're still young, at their most impressionable and most moldable. This is crucial to the right and maintenance of fascistic nations. After all, he alone who owns the youth gains the future. And that philosophy transcends fascism into the modern liberal democracies of the Western world. People don't want government. If you removed all the mind control techniques out of modern Western societies and taught the wisdom and independence of Socrates and Nietzsche, those societies would collapse. And the collapse of those societies would result in harmony. People themselves choosing how they live, not what the gold chose for them. That's why the aristocracy killed Socrates. Authoritarianism isn't so stable after all. Without behavioural control and the manipulation of the individual's external environment, authoritarian chaos gives way to a libertarian order. Like a ball at the top of a hill which is removed from its container of manipulation and brutal domination starts rolling, it won't stop until it reaches an optimal equilibrium. That equilibrium is the natural process of decentralization, the explosion of intellectual curiosity which triggers worldwide skepticism against all authority. If we wanted statism, we wouldn't have to be forced into statism. If we were given the option as free-thinking intellectuals, nobody would choose to be a slave. We didn't choose where we live. The aristocracy chose for us where to live. The aristocracy chose for us what we learn. The aristocracy chose for us what we think and believe. Do we really have free will if our minds are erased before we reach our teens? How many millions or billions of people have been deprived of their desires to ask these questions? The death of curiosity isn't natural. It's an artificial process forced upon all of us, who the powerful dictate are no good for anything except flipping burgers and buying useless commodities to keep a superficial smile on our faces. We seek meaning. If we're unable to find it, we seek to fill the void. Happiness becomes nothing but another commodity which we're reinforced to want by our manipulative culture. We get a quick shot of happy juice from getting these commodities, but we buy and buy and buy, and it never fulfills us for the long term. It's fake happiness that we are taught to want, not genuine fulfillment which comes from reaching the peak of our hierarchy of needs. We get a hope of this lost fulfillment with companies telling us to think different, be unique, don't follow the crowd. It gels with our suppressed inner desires to be this inner intellectual which was killed during our school years. The suppressed mind, out of desperation, declares its independence and creativity through an overpriced, underpowered electronic device with a picture of an apple on the back. That's what independent free thought looks like. Not like an agora of different minds coming together for discussions and debates, no. But like an overpriced electronic product which you have little control over customizing, which probably spies on you and sells all your information to private companies and the government. The freest of all free minds allows this to happen after all. To most of us, free thought isn't a genuine concept we strive to achieve. It is nothing more than an empty, vacuous slogan to sell phones. Nothing but a cliche. Nothing meaningful, but it still grips us by the neglected inner child. We all want it. We all want to believe that we have free will, and that we're the masters of our own destiny. But since we started to psychologically engineer the minds of birds to get them to do what we want them to do, that idea of free will is becoming one which is harder and harder to hold on to. The tighter the grip of one's external environment over them, the easier it is to control them. This is the development of totalitarianism, from enslaving both mind and body to separating them into freeing the body but keeping the mind in chains. It is much more preferable to free the body. If the body is free, then the inhabitant of said body will not realise he's a slave. The man believes he is free, unaware of how his mind is being controlled and developed by a manipulated environment. His mind is keeping him a slave. His mind is being locked away in the unconscious where he never notices it. Totalitarianism never went away. It simply evolved to become much more subtle. You can easily see your enemy's propaganda for what it is, but can you see your own country's propaganda for what it is? You're not supposed to be able to do that. If you can, then the operant conditioning process of mind clearance has failed, and you have psychologically survived. And you should appreciate that. Not many people get through 12 years of brainwashing in childhood and are able to retain their skepticism. Because you are skeptical, you don't just walk a path because everyone else is walking down it. You seek something which you can be sure about to yourself. After all, there's no one that knows you better than you. Thanks for watching. I have a Discord server dedicated to this channel. You can find it in the description. In this server, we will be cooperating with each other to make more high quality videos like the one you just watched. The journey less travelled isn't just me, it is all of you involved in this process too. If you have an idea for a video, suggest it in the ideas and brainstorming section of the server for all of us to know, and we'll gladly help you expand this idea into a fully fledged video. You can also practice writing in the sandbox section, and again, the journey less travelled is a community of intellectual minds who are looking for more great minds like yourself to propose new ideas and improve on existing ideas. We can't wait to see you there, and any video you contribute to the process of making, you will be given a shout out at the beginning of that video along with everyone else involved. If you want more high quality videos from me and the community, drop a bit of money into our Patreon, that's linked in the description. If you want to mirror this video or any other video on my channel, you can do that too. However, it would be nice if you link to the original video in your description. I can't wait to see what you'll come up with as we walk alongside each other along the journey less travelled.